The sun had barely risen, casting its pale light over the city of Los Angeles as the hum of morning traffic began to fill the streets. It was 7:38 a.m. on a Monday, the beginning of another busy work week. On Sunset Boulevard, the city's pulse was alive with the sound of engines revving and tires screeching across the asphalt. Among the thousands of cars, something caught the eye of a woman waiting for the light to turn. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. A small figure, barely a toddler, walking alone in the middle of the busy street. Her breath caught in her throat as she raised a trembling hand to point, unable to look away. A little girl, no older than 3, was walking barefoot, her ragged nightgown trailing behind her. Dirt covered her small feet, and her hair, wild and untamed, blew fiercely in the wind. The child took small, hesitant steps, completely unaware of the danger surrounding her. The chaos of the street seemed oblivious to her presence. A bus screeched to a halt, its doors swinging open as the driver shouted in panic, "Get out of the way. What's a kid doing out here alone?" A taxi behind the bus swerved, narrowly avoiding a crash. The driver cursed loudly, furious at the sight of the girl in the middle of the road. "Call the police," he yelled, his voice thick with disbelief. Passers-by froze, unsure of how to react. A young man pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he filmed the scene. "Is this real?" he muttered to himself. The little girl wobbled in the middle of the street, her wide eyes filled with confusion. Her lips were turning purple from the cold, and her body shivered violently. Her gaze seemed to be focused on nothing at all, her small fingers clutching a ragged plastic doll tightly to her chest, as if it were her only source of comfort in this overwhelming world. Then something caught the attention of the people gathered around. On the child's back was a piece of white paper, taped securely. The writing on it was clear despite the shaking hands that had written it. The words, scrawled in black ink, sent a chill down the spines of anyone who saw them. "My name is Lily. My mom is dead." At that moment, a high-tech security camera perched on a nearby building captured the strange, haunting image of the girl alone in the street. The footage from the traffic control center blinked to life on a large screen, drawing the attention of the staff working tirelessly to manage the city's chaos. Commander Luis Moreno, standing in the control room, stared at the screen in shock. "Zoom in," he ordered, his voice tense. As the camera zoomed in on the little girl, the writing on her back became clearer. The room fell silent. Someone whispered under their breath, "Oh God, her mom is dead." Lewis's mind raced as he processed the information. Without a moment's hesitation, he gave the order to mobilize the emergency response team. Shut down all traffic around Sunset Boulevard within a 500-meter radius. Call in the nearest police units. Get an ambulance here and notify Child Protective Services immediately. His mind was already working through the possibilities. How could a little girl, no older than 3, end up alone in the middle of this chaotic street? What kind of life had she been living? As the sirens of approaching emergency vehicles pierced the air, Lieutenant Emily Harper was the first to arrive at the scene. She leaped out of her car, her boots hitting the pavement as she sprinted toward the child. The moment she saw Lily standing there, vulnerable and cold, her heart broke. Emily crouched down to the girl's level, her voice soft and calming. "Lily, right? You're safe now. Don't be scared. I'm here to help." The child didn't respond. Her eyes were wide, but they seemed to look past Emily, as if she didn't see the woman at all. Emily gently wrapped her own jacket around Lily's tiny frame, trying to shield her from the cold, the warmth of her body a small comfort in the harsh morning air. "You must be so cold, huh? We're going to find your mom. Don't worry, you're not alone." Despite Emily's reassurances, the child remained still, her grip tightening around the worn-out doll she clutched. A voice from behind interrupted their quiet moment. "I'm Dr. David Thompson. I work at the nearby ER. May I check on the girl?" He was a calm, composed man, his medical instincts kicking in immediately. Emily nodded, stepping aside to let the doctor approach. David knelt beside Lily, his eyes scanning her body. He felt her skin, which was cold to the touch, and observed her shivering violently. "Her body temperature is dangerously low," he muttered under his breath. "She's also dehydrated and showing signs of hypoglycemia. We need to get her to the hospital right away." Emily's gaze never left Lily, her concern growing with every passing second. "Is the ambulance here yet?" On the way, another officer called, his voice hurried but steady. "ETA 3 minutes." David took a small bottle of water from his bag and gently lifted it to Lily's lips. "Come on, sweetie, drink a little," he coaxed. The child didn't respond, but she allowed him to tilt the bottle toward her mouth. She took a small sip before going still again, her vacant eyes locked on David's face. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She had seen many children in distress before, but this was different. Lily wasn't just lost. There was a deep, unspoken sadness in her eyes. As the ambulance arrived, the paramedics rushed to take over. They placed the shivering girl onto a stretcher, covering her with a warm blanket as they started administering fluids. Lily's hand, so small and fragile, was held tightly by Dr. David as he continued to reassure her. "Don't worry, sweetheart," David whispered, his voice soft. "We're going to find your mom. You're going to be okay." But in his heart, David knew there was a chance things wouldn't turn out okay. The note on Lily's back haunted him, a haunting reminder of the child's heartbreaking situation. As the ambulance sped through the streets, David glanced at the officer beside him, his eyes filled with sorrow. "We need to prepare for the worst," he said quietly. "This marks the beginning of Lily's journey and sets the stage for a deep investigation into her life, her past, and the reason she was left to fend for herself on that busy street. Her story would unravel layer by layer as the police, doctors, and emergency responders worked together to piece together the puzzle of her past. But the road ahead would not be easy, and the truth would be far more disturbing than anyone could have ever imagined. The ambulance sped through the early morning traffic, its sirens wailing as the paramedics worked quickly, trying to stabilize Lily. The child remained silent, her tiny frame shaking beneath the blanket, eyes closed, as if lost in a world no one could reach. Dr. David Thompson sat beside her, his hand gently holding hers, feeling the coldness of her skin seep into his own. Despite the warmth of the ambulance, Lily's condition seemed to worsen by the minute. Her pulse was weak, her body failing to keep up with the shock it had endured. David's mind raced as the city blurred past. He could feel his heart pounding with urgency, but there was something else nagging at him, something unsettling. The note on Lily's back had stirred an ache in his chest, a sense of sorrow mixed with frustration. "My mom is dead," it read, and he couldn't help but wonder what had happened to this little girl. Who was her mother? And what had led this child to wander alone in the middle of one of the busiest streets in Los Angeles, her life seemingly an afterthought to the world around her? The thought made him shudder, but there was no time for answers now, only action. As the ambulance approached the hospital, the team prepped for her arrival. David stepped out first, making sure the stretcher was ready and the emergency room team was waiting. "We need a full workup as soon as she's in," he instructed, his voice filled with authority but laced with concern. The nurses and doctors were already preparing, moving quickly, their faces drawn with the seriousness of the situation. But Lily didn't stir, not even as they wheeled her into the emergency room. She lay there, still as a statue, a little girl with a life too heavy for her small shoulders. Minutes later, the team was working in tandem to stabilize her. IV fluids were started, a warming blanket placed over her, and tests ordered. But there was still no word on her mother, no answers to the questions that haunted David's mind. A child this young, alone on the street, with no adult to care for her, was an anomaly in itself. How had she gotten there? And why was she carrying that haunting note? Meanwhile, back at the scene on Sunset Boulevard, the police had already started their investigation. Lieutenant Emily Harper, who had been the first responder, was now at the command center, working with the team of officers who had arrived at the scene. The image of Lily, alone in the street, had left an indelible mark on her heart. She couldn't shake the thought of the little girl's eyes, so wide, so lost, as if she had seen too much for someone her age. Emily knew something wasn't right. "Any updates on the investigation?" Emily asked, her voice tense as she walked into the command room, where the police had gathered around a table covered in maps and photographs. "Yes," one officer replied, his face grim as he pointed to a section of the map. "We've identified the area where the child was last seen. Camera 11C shows her walking toward the Skid Row neighborhood, a known area for high crime rates and homelessness. We're pulling footage from all available cameras in that area. But there's something even more concerning. Her last known location is a building called the Elm Street Housing Project. It's a notorious part of the city, and we've already contacted the building management. We have a lead." Emily's heart skipped a beat. The Elm Street Housing Project was a place known for its squalid conditions, filled with people living on the margins of society. Drugs, violence, and neglect ran rampant there. It was not a place for a child to be, let alone one as young as Lily. She immediately turned to the officer. "Get me in touch with whoever has the security footage from that building. I want to know everything. Who's the last person to have been seen with this child?" The officer nodded, his fingers quickly tapping on the keyboard. "We've got it, Lieutenant. Just came through." The screen in front of them lit up with a grainy image of a man, a large, intimidating figure, standing outside the building. He was talking to a woman who looked familiar, someone Emily had seen in the earlier footage of Lily, though she couldn't place the face. The man had a skull tattoo on his neck, and his posture radiated violence. Emily's stomach turned. It seemed that Lily's life had been marred by more than just neglect. There were darker forces at play, and Emily knew she had to act fast. "Get me a team. We're going to that building. I want every corner searched. We're going to find this man and figure out who he is." Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Dr. David Thompson continued his examination of Lily, who had finally started to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, and for the briefest moment, she met his gaze, but there was nothing in her expression. No recognition, no warmth, just a hollow emptiness. It was as if the world had taken something from her, and she had nothing left to give. "Do you remember your name?" David asked softly, hoping for any sign of connection. Lily's lips trembled, but she didn't speak. Instead, she reached out and grabbed the ragged plastic doll that lay next to her, clutching it as if it were her only lifeline. David's heart broke for her. This little girl had been through something unimaginable, and yet she couldn't bring herself to even utter a single word. David stood, his mind still racing with questions. He turned to the nurse standing nearby. "Have we gotten the results back from the blood work?" "Not yet, but she's still in critical condition." The nurse replied, "We're doing everything we can, but she's very dehydrated and malnourished. It's clear that she's been neglected for some time." David nodded grimly. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. But the more he learned, the more the situation seemed to spiral into a nightmare. A child this young, alone, and seemingly abandoned, was a tragedy on its own. But Lily's story was far from over. It was just beginning. As Emily and her team closed in on the building in the Skid Row area, she could feel the weight of the investigation pressing down on her. The closer they got, the more urgent the situation became. She knew that Lily's life depended on the answers they would find here, in this crumbling, forgotten part of the city. What would they uncover? What had Lily endured? And would they be able to save her before it was too late? The team arrived at the Elm Street Housing Project just as the sun began to climb higher in the sky. The area was as grim as Emily had feared. Dilapidated buildings, peeling paint, and trash-strewn streets created a stark contrast to the glitzy exterior of Los Angeles just a few miles away. This part of the city was often forgotten by the world, ignored by those who lived in the city's brighter, more prosperous areas. But not by Emily. Not today. Today, she was determined to find answers. As she stepped out of the car, the weight of the air seemed to press against her chest. The building was an old gray structure that had clearly seen better days. There was a sense of desperation in the air, an undercurrent of fear and hopelessness that lingered in the shadows of the streets. The windows were covered with faded curtains, and the few people lingering outside had eyes that darted around nervously, aware of the heightened police presence. Emily's team split up, moving swiftly and methodically. She wasn't sure what they would find here, but everything in her told her that Lily's life, her entire future, was tied to this place. There was something here that they needed to uncover, something that could change the course of the investigation, and possibly save Lily's life. They entered the building, the smell of mildew and decay hitting them as they passed through the doorway. The hallway was narrow, dimly lit, and lined with peeling wallpaper. The buzz of fluorescent lights overhead added to the oppressive atmosphere, making every footstep feel like an echo in a space that hadn't been properly cared for in years. Emily and her team moved quietly but quickly, knocking on doors, showing the grainy photo of Lily, and asking questions about her mother, about anyone who might have known her. Most of the residents were reluctant to speak, their faces drawn, defensive, as if they had learned long ago not to trust the authorities. But a few gave bits and pieces of information that began to paint a disturbing picture. A woman in her 30s, who was reluctant at first, finally spoke up when Emily showed her the photo of Lily. "That little girl," she said, voice trembling. "She lives in 12B with her mom. Well, her mom used to live there. She's been gone for weeks, maybe longer. I don't know what happened to her, but the man, Richard, he's trouble. I've seen him come and go. But that girl, she'd just sit there, all quiet, looking like she was afraid to move. You don't see kids like her just wandering around, not in a place like this." Emily's stomach sank at the mention of Richard. The same man, the one with the skull tattoo, had been seen with Grace, Lily's mother. But what had happened to her? Why was she gone? And why was Richard still here? The woman's words had confirmed something Emily had feared. This wasn't a simple case of neglect. There were deeper, darker forces at work. The woman continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I don't know what happened between them, but I heard the arguing. It was loud. People hear it, but no one does anything. Richard, he's violent. I've seen him hit Grace before, seen him slam the door when she tried to leave. The last time I saw her, she looked different, like she was beaten up. I think she was trying to get away. But Richard's dangerous. He's got connections. People here are scared of him." Emily nodded, taking mental notes. This was the breakthrough they had needed. Richard was violent, and Lily had been exposed to it. But what did it all mean for the child's safety now? If Grace had tried to leave, had she succeeded, or had she vanished? And where was Richard now? The team continued searching the building, knocking on doors, talking to more residents. Some denied knowing anything. Others gave fragmented accounts of Richard's volatile behavior. But no one had seen Grace for weeks, and no one knew exactly where she had gone. The more Emily learned, the clearer it became that Lily had been living in an environment of fear and neglect, isolated from the world outside, trapped by the darkness of her mother's choices and Richard's menacing presence. As they continued through the building, they came upon an elderly woman, sitting on a threadbare couch in a dimly lit apartment. Her frail figure was hunched over, knitting something slowly, her hands shaking with age. She looked up when Emily entered, her tired eyes meeting the officer's gaze with a mixture of wariness and resignation. "We're looking for a little girl named Lily," Emily said gently, showing her the photo. "Do you know her?" The old woman's face softened as she took in the image. "Lily, I know her," she murmured. "She's a sweet girl, poor thing. Always quiet, never makes a sound. I don't know what happened to her, Mama. I saw them together once or twice. But that man, Richard, he's bad news. I've heard him shouting at Grace. That man's got a temper. He's got a record, you know. The police have been called more than once because of him. Emily's heart tightened. It was clear that Richard's presence loomed over every conversation. He was a shadow that cast itself over Lily's life, filling it with fear and uncertainty. The pieces were coming together, but there were still so many questions left unanswered. "Do you know where Richard is now?" Emily asked, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. The old woman hesitated, her eyes darting toward the window, as if she was afraid to speak. After a long pause, she sighed. "I don't know for sure, but last I heard, he was hanging around the corner of 12th and Broadway. I heard he's in with some people who might be able to help him lay low. If you catch my drift." Emily nodded, her instincts telling her that this was where they needed to go next. Richard was somewhere out there, hiding, and every minute they spent looking for him meant more time for Lily to remain in danger. It was clear that they were up against something far bigger than a simple case of child neglect. This was a story of broken lives, shattered hopes, and a desperate search for safety. As Emily left the building and climbed into the car, her mind raced. Where was Richard? Why had he let Lily roam the streets alone? And what had happened to Grace? She knew that finding Richard would be the key to unlocking the truth about Lily's past. But there were no guarantees, not in a city like this, where shadows hid the worst of humanity's secrets. Every answer brought more questions, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of something far darker than they could imagine. The streets of Skid Row were a stark contrast to the busy, polished areas of Los Angeles just a few miles away. As Emily and her team made their way down 12th and Broadway, the grim reality of the neighborhood hit them like a wall. The once vibrant district had long since fallen into disrepair, with boarded-up windows, graffiti-scored walls, and a thick sense of hopelessness that hung in the air. The corner where Richard had been reportedly seen was no different, dimly lit, full of shadows, and teeming with people whose faces held stories of struggles they could never fully tell. The team parked a few blocks away and began their approach on foot, the sounds of the city echoing around them. The distant wail of car alarms, the hum of a dozen different conversations happening all at once, and the occasional shout from one of the many street vendors trying to make a living. The air felt thick, as if the weight of everything that had happened here, all the lives broken and left behind, was suffocating the very space they walked through. Emily glanced at her team. She knew the danger they were in. This wasn't just a routine investigation. It felt different. They weren't just hunting for a missing child anymore. They were about to uncover something far more dangerous than they had imagined, and they needed to be prepared for whatever came next. As they rounded the corner, a man with a gaunt face, wearing an oversized jacket and a faded beanie, stepped out of an alleyway and approached them. His eyes were dark and restless, constantly shifting as if he was keeping a lookout for something or someone. "Hey," he said in a low voice, his tone cautious but not unfriendly. "You looking for someone?" Emily held up the photo of Lily, keeping her expression neutral but firm. "We're looking for a man named Richard. Have you seen him around here recently?" The man eyed the photo for a moment, his lips curling into a frown. "Richard, huh? Big guy. Skull tattoo on his neck, right?" He muttered. "Yeah, I seen him. A few days ago. He was with some guys over by the old warehouse. You sure you want to go looking for him? Ain't no good for anyone who's got their nose in his business." Emily could feel the weight of the man's warning settle on her shoulders, but she couldn't back down now. "We have to find him. He's connected to a little girl named Lily. She's in danger, and we need to know where he is." The man hesitated for a long moment before shaking his head, his eyes darting around nervously. "You didn't hear it from me," he said in a hushed tone. "But I think Richard's been laying low in the old warehouse. It's down near the end of the block. Be careful. That guy's dangerous. Ain't nobody in this neighborhood that can stand up to him for long." Emily nodded, her hand instinctively resting on the holster of her gun. "Thank you. Stay safe." The team moved quickly but cautiously toward the warehouse, their hearts pounding in their chests with the weight of their mission. As they reached the entrance, Emily held up her hand, signaling for everyone to stop. The warehouse loomed ahead, its massive doors slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. It was abandoned, save for a few pieces of forgotten machinery and what looked like makeshift bedding scattered around the floor. The place was filthy, and the air smelled of mold and decay, but there was a sense that it had been more than just a warehouse at some point. It had been a home, or at least a place where people had taken refuge when they had nowhere else to go. "Stay alert," Emily whispered to her team. "We don't know what we're walking into." They pushed the door open further, stepping inside cautiously. The warehouse was dimly lit, the only light coming from a few small windows near the ceiling, where the dust danced in the faint beams of sunlight. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the space as they moved deeper inside. It was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the building settling under its own weight. Then they heard it. A faint sound, a rustling noise from the back of the warehouse. Emily motioned for the team to split up, and they moved swiftly toward the noise, guns drawn, ready for whatever might come. At the far end of the building, they found a group of men gathered around a table. One of them was unmistakably Richard, the man they had been hunting for. His face was cold and hard, his skull tattoos stark against the pale skin of his neck. He was sitting in a chair, arms crossed, talking in a low voice to a few men who looked just as dangerous as he did. Emily's instincts screamed that this was no ordinary criminal. Richard was more than just a thug. He was someone with connections, someone who could make the kind of trouble that could tear a city apart. But what was he doing here, in this abandoned warehouse? And why hadn't he run when he knew the police were looking for him? Before Emily could make a move, one of Richard's associates spotted them. "Cops!" he shouted, reaching for a weapon. But before anyone could react, Emily's team was already in motion. There was a blur of movement as the officers moved in, taking control of the situation with practiced precision. Richard, however, didn't seem to be fazed. He stood slowly, his eyes locking with Emily's as if daring her to make the first move. "I know why you're here," Richard said, his voice deep and gruff. "But you're not going to get what you want. Not from me." Emily didn't flinch. "Where's Lily?" she demanded, her voice hard. "You know exactly what happened to her. We're not leaving until we get some answers." Richard smirked, leaning against a pile of crates, his eyes flickering with a dangerous glint. "You want to know about the little girl. She's nothing more than a pawn in a bigger game. You should have stayed out of it while you could." The tension in the room was thick, and for a moment, Emily wasn't sure how this would end. She had no doubt Richard was dangerous, and if he had anything to do with Lily's condition, he would stop at nothing to protect himself. But Emily wasn't about to back down, not when a child's life was on the line. "Where is she?" Emily repeated, her voice unwavering. Richard's eyes darted toward the back of the warehouse, and Emily followed his gaze, wondering if she was about to find the answers she had been desperately searching for. Would they finally find Lily? Or was this just the beginning of something much darker? Richard's eyes were like steel, cold and calculating, but Emily didn't flinch. She knew the stakes now. Everything she had worked for, everything they had fought for up to this point, came down to this moment. There was no turning back. The air in the warehouse felt heavy, charged with tension. Each breath she took seemed to amplify the silence around them. The kind of silence that only exists in places where dangerous people lurk and where lives are often discarded with little thought. The men surrounding Richard were tense, ready for a fight. Some of them seemed nervous, their eyes flicking between Emily and her team, but none of them made a move yet. They were waiting for something, and Emily wasn't sure if that something was her misstep or the order from Richard to strike. Richard didn't seem to be in a hurry. His lips twisted into a sneer as he leaned back against a stack of crates. He had the look of someone who believed he was in control, as though he held all the cards and knew that, sooner or later, the pressure would break the police team. But Emily wasn't going to let that happen. "You think you can scare me, officer?" Richard finally spoke, his voice low and mocking. "You think you can just come in here and tear everything apart without consequences?" "I think you're underestimating us," Emily replied, her voice sharp and unwavering. "You've been running from the law for far too long. And now, you've made a mistake. The mistake of thinking you can control everything." Richard's lips curled into a twisted smile. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he muttered, his gaze flickering briefly toward one of his associates. There was an unspoken understanding between them, something that told Emily there was more to Richard than met the eye. He was deeply entrenched in something bigger, something that extended far beyond the lives he had destroyed in this neighborhood. But it was too late now. He couldn't hide anymore. Not from them, not from Lily. Emily took a step closer, locking eyes with him. "Where is she, Richard?" Her voice was firm, yet compassionate, carrying the weight of everything they had uncovered. "Where is Lily? We're not leaving here without her." For the first time, Richard hesitated. His face momentarily flickered with something. Was it fear or guilt? Emily couldn't be sure, but whatever it was enough for her to press further. "You think this is over, don't you?" he said, his tone softer now, as though he were trying to convince himself. "This is just the beginning. You don't know how deep this goes. Lily isn't just some innocent little girl you can save. She's part of something bigger than you, bigger than all of us." The words sent a chill through Emily's body, a coldness that sank deep into her bones. Richard's cryptic statement confirmed her worst fear. This wasn't just about Lily. It wasn't just about a lost, vulnerable child caught in the web of an abusive relationship. This was part of a much larger, more dangerous scheme. A world that had swallowed Grace whole. A world that had almost done the same to Lily. But Emily wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. "You're wrong," Emily said firmly. "This ends now. We'll find Lily. We'll find Grace. And we'll make sure you answer for everything you've done." Richard stood still for a moment, his eyes narrowing as though he were contemplating something, weighing his options. Emily could see his mind working, trying to calculate his next move. He wasn't a fool, and she knew it. He had connections, resources, and probably a dozen escape routes in his back pocket. But none of that mattered now. Lily's life, her future, was in the balance, and that was what kept Emily standing tall in the face of Richard's threat. Before Richard could say another word, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the tense silence. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Her backup had arrived. "Let's finish this," she said under her breath, nodding to her team. They were ready. Richard's eyes flicked toward the sound of the sirens, and for a brief second, Emily saw something that almost looked like regret flash across his face. But it was gone just as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual arrogance. He motioned to one of his associates, a large man with a scar running down his face. The man moved to the back of the warehouse, but Emily wasn't going to let anyone get away. She motioned to Officer Reed, who immediately followed him. The rest of the team fanned out, securing the warehouse, making sure no one else could slip through. "Enough," Richard shouted, stepping forward, his posture aggressive now. "You're making a mistake, officer. You think you can just waltz in here and take me down. You don't know the half of it. People like me don't get caught." "Maybe you're right," Emily said, her voice steady. "But you're about to learn something new. People like you get caught when people like me refuse to back down." Richard didn't answer. Instead, he turned sharply, as if he was about to run. But Emily's team was already on him. They moved in, swift and practiced, subduing his associates in a matter of seconds. Richard struggled, but it was futile. The net had closed in. As Richard was cuffed and hauled to his feet, Emily's mind raced. The sirens wailed outside, signaling that the backup had arrived. But it wasn't just about Richard anymore. It was about finding Lily, getting her to safety. They moved quickly, knowing that the clock was ticking. Emily's eyes scanned the warehouse, And that's when she noticed it. Behind a pile of crates, there was a small door, barely visible through the shadows. She nodded to Officer Harper, and the two of them made their way toward it. When Emily opened the door, she was met with a chilling sight. The room was small, cluttered with old furniture, and there, huddled in the corner, was Lily. Her tiny body was curled into a ball, her face streaked with dirt, and her eyes were wide with fear. Her ragged doll clutched tightly in her hands. Lily looked up at Emily with a mixture of confusion and trust. Without thinking, Emily knelt down in front of her, offering her the warmth of her jacket. "Hey, sweetie. It's okay. We're here to take you home." Lily didn't speak, but she slowly reached out, her tiny hand trembling as it found Emily's. It was a small gesture, but it was the most powerful one Emily had ever experienced. In that moment, she knew they had made a difference. They had found Lily, and they would never let her go. The ride back to the station was one of the most intense moments of Emily's career. As the ambulance sped through the city streets, Lily's small hand still gripped hers tightly. Emily had never felt a connection to anyone as she did in that moment. She could feel the warmth of the little girl's trembling fingers, the silent cry for help that spoke volumes more than words could ever express. The sirens wailed as they cut through the chaos of the city, but for Emily, it felt as though the world around her had slowed down. The traffic, the noise, the people all seemed distant, irrelevant. All that mattered now was Lily, her safety, and how to make sure this fragile child would never face such horror again. Every mile that passed seemed to be a beat in the rhythm of hope, as if with each second they were getting closer to making this nightmare disappear for Lily once and for all. When they reached the hospital, a team of doctors and nurses was waiting. They'd moved quickly, taking Lily from the stretcher and into the emergency room, but Emily refused to let go of her hand. As the team worked to stabilize Lily, Emily stayed by her side, watching over the child as if her life depended on it. And in a way, it did. This was her redemption, her chance to make sure a child didn't slip through the cracks, her chance to prove that justice could be done, no matter how broken the world seemed. Hours passed, and Emily remained in the hospital waiting room, surrounded by the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of footsteps. Her team had already begun the investigation, following up on Richard's connections, trying to piece together the full story of what had happened to Lily, to her mother Grace, and to everyone else trapped in Richard's world. But the most important thing right now was Lily. Eventually, the doctor came out. Dr. David Thompson, the same one who had been first on the scene, walked toward Emily with a weary expression. His scrubs were wrinkled, his face tired, but his eyes held the quiet compassion of someone who had seen the worst of humanity and still believed in hope. "She's stable," Dr. Thompson said, his voice low but filled with relief. "She was dehydrated, malnourished, and very cold. We've got fluids in her now, and her temperature's normalizing. She's a tough little girl." Emily exhaled, her shoulders relaxing for the first time that day. "Is she going to be okay?" Dr. Thompson gave a small, reassuring smile. "She's going to be just fine. Physically, at least. Mentally, we're going to have to take it slow. She's been through a lot. But with time, she'll heal." Emily nodded, the weight of those words settling over her. She had saved Lily from the immediate danger, but the real work, helping her heal, helping her find peace, was just beginning. Emily couldn't imagine the trauma Lily had endured, the kind of world she had been forced to survive in. And the thought of the little girl being left to face it all alone made Emily's heart break in ways she couldn't articulate. As the evening wore on, Emily's thoughts drifted to Grace, the woman who had given birth to Lily, the woman who had loved her, and the woman who had somehow fallen victim to Richard's cruelty. What had happened to her? Where had she gone? Why hadn't anyone been able to find her sooner? The case had taken an unexpected turn, and now there were more questions than answers. Richard, in his arrogance, had given them a clue, but not enough to solve everything. There was still so much left to uncover. But Emily knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't rest until Grace was found, until every part of this story was brought to light. As night fell over the city, Emily finally left the hospital. Her mind was heavy with the knowledge that the case was far from over, but there was something inside her that felt lighter. They had saved Lily, and for now, that was enough. She knew she would return to the hospital to visit her, to make sure the little girl felt safe and secure. But for tonight, she needed to regroup. There was still so much left to do. The next few days were a blur of paperwork, interviews, and investigation. The police were relentless in their pursuit of justice. The team followed every lead, digging deeper into Richard's past, into his connections, into the dark web of criminal activity he was tied to. They discovered that he was part of a larger, dangerous network, one that had been operating under the radar for years, exploiting vulnerable individuals for profit. Richard wasn't just a street thug. He was a cog in a much larger, more insidious machine. But even as they closed in on the network, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered about Richard's dealings, but Grace remained elusive. No one had seen her for days, and there were no reports of her ever being admitted to the hospital after her disappearance. It was as if she had vanished without a trace, swept away by the very darkness that had consumed so many others. Emily's search for Grace led her to a series of dead ends, until one day, as she sat at her desk, reviewing the case file, an unexpected breakthrough came. A woman had been found in a nearby shelter, suffering from severe injuries and disorientation. When the woman was shown a photo of Lily, she broke down in tears. "I know her," the woman said through sobs. "She's my daughter. Her name is Grace, but I never thought I'd see her again." Emily's heart raced. Could this be Grace? Was this the same woman who had disappeared? She rushed to the shelter, hoping that this could be the moment they had been waiting for. When she saw Grace, battered and bruised but alive, her heart ached. Grace had been living in the shelter for weeks, trying to escape the clutches of the man who had abused her, but she hadn't been able to escape until now. Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she watched mother and daughter reunite. Lily had been found, and now Grace would be too. The family was whole again. It wasn't just a case solved. It was a life saved. Emily knew that the road ahead would still be difficult. There would be therapy, healing, and long hours of recovery. But for the first time in what felt like forever, there was hope. As Emily stood at the edge of the shelter, watching Grace and Lily embrace, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had done what she came here to do. She had brought them home. And as the sun set over the city, casting a golden glow on the street below, Emily knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter for both Grace and Lily. It was a chapter where they would find safety, healing, and most importantly, love. No one could take that away from them now. Not ever again.